Rick Goldschmidt, welcome to the Chad Silveus Show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Now, you are a historian and a biographer for the Rankin Bass Productions Company, which, of course, is known for so many things, but especially for those magical Christmas specials like Rudolph, Little Drummer Boy, Santa Claus is Coming to Town, Year Without a Santa Claus. You've written a book. You know more about Rankin Bass than any person, I guess, on the planet. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, and I've actually written my sixth book on Rankin Bass this year. And I worked with Arthur Rankin Jr. for about 30 years of his life. So he was always available to me if I had any questions. And I felt like I was one of his sons.
Now, what was your working relationship with Arthur Rankin Jr.?
Well, basically the way it all happened was my degree's in illustration, and I went to Columbia College in Chicago, and I was going to be an illustrator. And I started talking to Jack Davis and Paul Coker Jr., two of my favorite artists out of Mad Magazine, and they did a lot of humorous illustration, which is what I was getting into. And then I realized that they also designed all of the Rankin Bass shows. So I said, whatever happened to Arthur Rankin and Jules Bass? You don't read anything about them. You know, to me, they were like Walt Disney and Hanna-Barbera, you know, one of the big companies, and you don't see anything about them. So they both said they were still working for Arthur, and that I should give him a call, which I did in Bermuda. And I said, there really should be a book, and I'll do it. And he was like, oh, yeah, right, sure. Send me 2 chapters. So I sent him 2 chapters, and then he sent me his life story on a micro cassette. And from there, I just started scrounging up every little piece of history I could find on Rankin Bass. And my first book came out in 1997, and then shortly thereafter, all the merchandise started coming out because I said there was no merchandising on Rudolph and Frosty and all the Rankin Bass specials, so that's why there is so much today.
So many people have been touched by the Rankin Bass Productions, the stop motion animation Christmas specials, and obviously there's even more I want to talk about, other things they did. But I just want to say, just because I've never had the opportunity to talk to somebody who had such a close relationship with that company or with those 2 men, I've never been able to talk to anybody about it, and so this is exciting to me. But I must say, right off the bat, there was nothing from my childhood that was more magical than those Christmas specials. Still to this day, when I watch those Rankin Bass stop motion animation TV specials, it gives me a feeling like nothing else I've ever experienced. Do you understand what I'm speaking about?
Yeah, I was talking about that earlier today. They called their stop motion Animagic, and I think they chose the right word because you can break down their specials, as I did in my Rudolph book and my Santa Claus is Coming to Town book and my Frosty book. You could break down every little facet of the show, the writing, the music, the art, everything. But you still can't describe that magic that's contained in the show. I think it had a lot to do with the writing. Romeo Muller was a genius, and he didn't just write for children, he wrote for all ages, and the characters were always underdogs and the villains were reformed, and it's a much more satisfying story than a lot of the other stories that are being told today. They just don't understand. You have to have heart and warmth and charm, and the quality is a big word, but they hired people that were experienced, that had 20 years experience in whatever field it was, in music and art. And it's unlike today where, you know, they're hiring people right out of college, paying them $10 an hour, and then they leave after they realize they're getting taken advantage of and burned out. These were people that had a talent for what they did, and Arthur Rankin recognized the talent and stuck with these people. The same people that worked on Rudolph worked on the specials for 20 years. So that's why most of them have that charm and that magic that made Rankin Bass last so long. The longevity is just what you said. It's that magic that it's hard to describe, but it's there because of all the talented people that were involved.
You mentioned that you kind of viewed Rankin Bass along with like Disney and Hanna-Barbera, and the thing is that all the Christmas specials that have been made, there's been some classics. Obviously the Charlie Brown Christmas is just a spectacular, and the Grinch. There's other things like that, but nothing in my mind compares to the Rankin Bass Christmas specials. There's nothing that Disney has done or is I can foresee doing that could even come close to the magic of the Rankin Bass Christmas specials in regards to holiday movies or specials. Jim Henson Company did a great job with Emmett Otter, but to me, Rankin Bass is the feature of Christmas. I look forward to it every year. My kids do. I mean, it's timeless. Multiple generations just love these productions. Now, how did the two of them, Arthur Rankin Jr. and Jules Bass, how did they get together in their partnership?
Well, Arthur Rankin was the art director at ABC Television when it started. So he was the art director on live television shows like Tales of Tomorrow. And eventually he met Jules because Jules was working for an ad agency. And from time to time, their paths would cross because he wrote jingles and he worked with this ad agency. So Arthur he started the company on his own. It was called Videocraft International, and it was primarily making commercials. Eventually, he went to Japan, discovered the stop motion style that was really extraordinary in 1959, and he decided he was going to do The New Adventures of Pinocchio as a TV series because Pinocchio was his favorite Disney film. And he did this series basically on his own. Jules was brought in to do some of the music, but he wasn't an official partner until a little bit later. And they also did a TV series of The Wizard of Oz in cell animation the next year. But those two adventures cost them a lot of money, and Arthur had to borrow money from one of his former Navy friends. Lent them $50,000 to finish Pinocchio. So those two things got on television, and they were on the children's shows of the day. In Chicago, it was Garfield Goose and Friends, and they would show an episode once a day for 5 minutes. 5 episodes made up a storyline. But the money wasn't that great, and they weren't that happy with that. And that's when Rudolph and Return to Oz came along with the General Electric Company. And they made specials for GE, and then GE started their own company called Tomorrow Entertainment and financed all the Rankin Bass specials. And that's why Arthur Rankin and Jules Bass didn't actually own the specials. Because GE did all the financing.
You're saying that their first big project together for GE was Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, is that correct?
Well, Return to Oz aired before it in cell animation, but that didn't make that big of a splash. That was in February of 1964. And it was the first time The Wizard of Oz had a sequel to it. The actual MGM movie had a sequel. So they thought it was going to be a big deal, and GE did a tie-in with a little charm bracelet, but it didn't really take off that big. And then Rudolph came along, December 6th of 64, and it was a huge hit. It won the ratings, and it was big. And that actually led to a film deal with Joseph E. Levine, a 3-picture deal, and many more television specials after that. So Rudolph was really their first big hit.
Do you know why they chose to do Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer as a special?
Well, Johnny Marks, who wrote the song, and his brother-in-law, Robert L. May, owned the character of Rudolph, and Arthur Rankin lived near Johnny Marks in New York. He had a brownstone right next to Johnny Marks. So Arthur tried to persuade him to do something in television with it, and he didn't want to do it. But eventually the GE company was interested, and NBC was interested, and actually Larry Romer, who was sort of a partner at that time, had an in with NBC. So everything was on track to do a TV special, and they had Johnny Marks write the rest of the songs. But many people don't know that the other characters, like Yukon Cornelius, the Bumble, and Hermie the Dentist, and all of those other characters on the island, the Misfit Toys, those were not created by Johnny Marks or Robert L. May. They were created by Romeo Muller and Tony Peters. Tony Peters was the designer. He worked with Rankin Bass from the mid-50s to the mid-60s. And those two came up with all of those characters. So to me, it really took off because of all the characters added in and the personality that they gave to these characters. And you mentioned the Charlie Brown Christmas and the Grinch, which I love those specials, and I love Mr. Magoo's Christmas Carol too. But Rankin Bass gave personality to Rudolph, to Santa, to Mrs. Santa, to Frosty. You know, they brought in the Heat Miser and Snow Miser. All these characters that we so identify with Christmas were basically created by either Romeo Muller and Tony Peters or Romeo Muller and Paul Coker.
When I think of Christmas, anything, you know, besides thinking about obviously that, you know, we're celebrating the birth of Jesus, besides that, the first thing that pops in my mind are the Rankin Bass TV specials. What was the most successful of all the holiday specials that Rankin Bass produced? What was the most successful? Was it Rudolph?
It would have to be Rudolph and Frosty. But when I do my appearances and I have my table set up with all the characters, I would say the most popular characters they created were the Heat Miser and the Snow Miser, because everybody that walks by points at them and says, Heat Miser, Snow Miser. It doesn't matter what nationality they are, what age they are. It doesn't matter. They know those characters. And they don't say, hey, there's Rudolph, there's Frosty. They always point at the Heat Miser and Snow Miser.
They made some sort of a sequel. Obviously, did Rankin and Bass have actually anything to do with that sequel?
No. And I remember when that came on, I turned it on and I had to turn it off within about 4 minutes. It was so bad. I couldn't watch it. It was just that bad. And they got the voices of George S. Irving, and I think they got Mickey Rooney for Santa or something, but man, it was that bad.
The original Rankin Bass productions, the authentic ones, there's nothing even to this day that can compare. But I just always wondered at the time, like, was this how close to the actual, you know, original production crew was it? Was there anybody involved with it? But obviously there wasn't.
No, not at all. And the Japanese people that did the actual animation pretty much closed up shop after the mid 80s. Because I always tried to get, you know, some more puppets made or some kind of animated thing done. And there was always an obstacle of, you know, they couldn't do it because they don't have the production facilities anymore. So they pretty much, once they called it quits with The Life and Adventures of Santa Claus in 1985, that was it.
Speaking of production of those Christmas specials, how long does it take to make a stop motion animation production like that? That's an hour long, or however long they were.
Yeah, Rudolph took about 18 months. And, they were shooting scenes simultaneously. So they had to make some duplicates of the various figures. But it took about 18 months for a 1 hour special and a little under a year for a half-hour special. And a lot of people ask, why did they do Frosty in cell animation, and why did they do some in cell animation and some in stop motion? And, well, first of all, Arthur wanted Frosty to look like a Christmas card. And Paul Coker Jr. was doing Christmas cards for Hallmark, and he used that lettering style on the cards. So they used the lettering style for the credits and the buildings and all that. It was for the look, but they also had a lot of projects going on simultaneously. So they had to hire other studios in Japan like Mushi and Toei to do some of the other cell animated things. So it was kind of for financial reasons and also for the artistic reasons as well.
You're the Rankin Bass historian, the biographer who had all this access to Arthur Rankin Jr.'s life and his stories, and you having all this firsthand knowledge in such a wealth of information, obviously being a fan of Rankin Bass Productions on top of it. What is your favorite non-Christmas Rankin Bass production? Well,
for non-Christmas, I love Mad Monster Party. I wrote a book about that film with Boris Karloff and Phyllis Diller, and it has all the classic monsters, and it's a perfect Halloween film. And there's so much about it that I love. I love the fact that Jack Davis designed it and did the movie poster art, and then Frank Frazetta stepped in and did some movie poster art, and they actually ended up using his roughs for the poster art. The music is different from the standard Rankin Bass shows. It still was written by Maury Laws and the lyrics were by Jules Bass, but it was more jazz oriented, which I really love. I love the music in the film. So that was my third book. And, I was very passionate about doing that book and the Rudolph book before it, because those are my two favorites. But I love everything they did. Our Santa Claus is Coming to Town book last year, that show has a lot of charm and magic to it. So I was proud to work on something involving that special as well.
Well, Rick, on my show, I have a special feature, a special segment called One Question with Violet. I have a beautiful 9-year-old little daughter named Violet. She loves to ask all my guests one question. Are you all right with that?
Sure.
All right, give me one moment. I'm going to step out of the studio and grab her. I'll be right back.
Okay.
Okay, Rick, I've got Violet, and here is One Question with Violet.
Who do you like better, Heat Miser or Snow Miser?
I think I like the Heat Miser better. Whenever I draw the two characters, he has more body to his face and hair and everything. And I think most people do like him better because he's so flamboyant. George S. Irving did his voice, and he did the narration on Underdog, the Underdog television show, and he did a lot of cool things. And Dick Shawn was the voice of the Snow Miser, and he was also great. But I think the Heat Miser wins out.
My favorite's the Heat Miser just because I love the warmth. I moved to Arizona just to be warm. Even if it's Christmas time, I want to be warm. So I've got that connection with the warmth. I grew up actually about 2 hours away from Chicago. I'm a big Chicago Bears fan. I experienced winter almost my whole life, but I had to get away. So the Heat Miser is my favorite. Now, Violet, what's your favorite, Heat Miser or Snow Miser?
Snow Miser.
Why?
Probably just because I like the cool, because I've been around heat almost my whole life, and I'm kind of getting sick of it.
Yeah, she's an Arizona girl, so she hasn't really experienced too many white Christmases.
I spent a lot of time in Arizona. First of all, my grandfather lived in Tempe when I was small, and we got to go see the Cubs in spring training when you could walk right up to the players, and it was more like a little league park in Mesa. And then years later, I recorded with the Gym Blossoms in Tempe, Arizona, where my grandfather lived, right by the university there. And we were right near University Drive where my grandfather lived when I was recording with the Gym Blossoms. And I did that for like 3 years in a row. I recorded like 3 CDs in Tempe with Robin Wilson, the singer of the Gym Blossoms, at his studio.
Wow, what a connection. And there's so many people from the Chicago area in Arizona or the Midwest. Like there's, everywhere you go, there's people who love the Cubs, love the Bears, or other Midwest teams, and we all seem to flock here. So maybe I'll see you here sometime.
Yeah, maybe.
Now, let's talk about what Jules Bass is up to today, because he's still working, if I understand it correctly.
Well, he was. I'm not sure what he's doing right now, but he was writing some children's books. In fact, he sent me one of them signed from Herb the Vegetarian Dragon. He did first a children's book based on Herb the Vegetarian Dragon, and then he did a cookbook version of that for children. And then he released a novel called Headhunters, which was a rewritten television script that never got made. And eventually it was purchased by Nicole Kidman, I believe, and it was made into a movie about 7 years ago called Monte Carlo. It might have been 5 years ago, maybe 7. And it came out, I remember when it came out, and it had some young actresses in it, but it didn't do that well because it wasn't out for very long. And the last I heard, he was trying to do a musical of some sort in New York, but that was the last I heard.
Well, when I found out he had a children's book series about Herb the Vegetarian Dragon, that caught my attention because I've been a vegan for 20 years now, a plant-based eater, and so I found that very interesting. But the concept of the book is like a story about a dragon who's a vegetarian. So there's multiple books in the series, is that correct?
There's a couple, and I think that came when he lived in France. He lived in France like the whole time I was, talking with Arthur, who was in Bermuda and New York. Eventually he got out of France because I think the crime was getting really bad there. And he moved to New York, not far from where Arthur had a home in Garrison. They lived in the same neighborhood. But he liked to cook, and he was doing a lot of that in France. And I think that's what the genesis of that book series was, that he really loved to cook, and he wanted to create something that would be great for the children's market and also work into food as well.
There's some other things that Rankin and Bass were involved with, like Thundercats.
Right. That was a real successful series. It kind of came after my time. I was in college when that was on. And so I wasn't fully aware of it, but there's a whole generation that grew up on it, that loves it, and there's been some resurgence of the show with remakes. And they're even always talking about doing a feature film of Thundercats. And I know Leonardo DiCaprio is a fan. Many people have told me that over the years. So, like I said, it's not from my generation, but I can appreciate it, and also appreciate the fact that a whole generation grew up on it. That and Silverhawks. And they did another series called The Comic Strip that involved tiger sharks, which was a similar group of characters.
Well, I was fortunate enough to not only, grow up with and experience all the Christmas Rankin Bass TV specials, but I also got to experience Silverhawks and Thundercats after school. Every day I get home from school, I get to watch those. I remember one Christmas I asked for, a bunch of both, I think, Thundercats and Silverhawks figures. I was blessed to be able to be exposed to it all and experience it all. Once again, everything they seemed to do was very magical.
Yeah, I knew about the show. I was aware of it, and I think I saw the toys in the store as well, but I didn't know how big it was until years later. I actually worked on the DVD sets, and I got Arthur Rankin to do an interview, and he didn't do very many, unless it was convenient. He didn't really want to do it for the DVDs, but he did one. And then they wanted me to get a new band to do the theme song, and I got the Gin Blossoms. And then they decided not to do it, maybe because they didn't feel like they could do the song justice. So they got their friends, the Rembrandts, to do it, because they worked a lot with the Rembrandts. So I was a big part of the initial DVD releases on that, and I lent all my I had the full archives of Thundercats, so I lent that all to Warner Brothers when they did the DVDs.
Now, when I talk to a lot of people who have kind of inside information about either actors or companies or politicians or whatever, somebody who has the inside scoop who sees things that most people don't see, I always want to ask them a question about, can you give us like one bit or one story, one detail about Rankin Bass or about a production they worked on that like is a little known fact or something that most people don't know about that you find extremely interesting?
Well, there's a lot of various stories on all of the productions. I know what's kind of interesting is their third special for NBC's The General Electric Fantasy Hour. The first one they did was Return to Oz. The second one was Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. And the third one was The Ballad of Smokey the Bear, which was an odd choice because it had nothing to do with the holidays, and it dealt with Smokey the Bear, who is owned by the government. But that particular year, that was 1966, they put the Smokey the Bear balloon in the Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade for the first time. And he's going to reappear this year for his 75th birthday. What was great about the special was they got James Cagney to narrate it. And in order to get James Cagney, he requested that Arthur go to the President of the United States at the time, Lyndon B. Johnson, and get a letter from him. So he got a letter from Lyndon, and when he told Lyndon James Cagney was going to be the narrator, he said, "That's my favorite actor. Of course I'll write a letter for that." And then when Arthur brought him the letter, James Cagney told Arthur that he knew his aunt, he knew his mother, he knew his father, he knew all these people in his family, and he kind of put him through that trouble of getting that letter as sort of a joke. It wasn't really necessary that he do it, but I don't know. I guess that was James Cagney's sense of humor.
That's exactly the type of story I was looking for. I knew you'd have something.
Arthur had to go to his farm to record him too. Like James Cagney wouldn't come into the studio. He had to take a mobile unit out to him at his farm to do the recording. And they did that sometimes with the actors. Like Boris Karloff was ill living in England. He had a bad case of shingles, and Arthur had to take a mobile unit to him to record his work for the film. So a lot of times they would do that, just to make sure that they got what they wanted.
Well, they captured magic. They just captured it. It was a moment in time, a multi-generational thing that is just pure magic. And I think I know the answer to this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Is there any possible situation on the horizon with Jules Bass still being alive? We talked a bit about how a lot of people who are involved obviously are getting up there in age. Is there any chance of anything else being produced in at least the spirit of Rankin Bass with some of the original people?
All this time that I've been doing the work with the books and knowing all these people, and they're all my friends, we could have done something, maybe 10 years ago. I tried to get a special made. I talked to Andy Williams and sent him some artwork. I had Paul Coker Jr. do him in the Rankin Bass style, and he loved it. And he was all ready to do a special. He called me up and said, I'll do it. And I was going to get the Osmonds involved as well, because Rankin Bass did the Osmond Brothers show, the Saturday morning cartoon, and it would have made perfect sense because Andy Williams, brought the Osmonds up on his show, and it would have been the perfect Christmas vehicle to do. They did show it around Arthur Rankin and Peter Bacallion and try to get people interested, but I guess they just couldn't get them interested in doing a retro Rankin Bass type special. So I gave it my all. I wanted to see it happen again, but unfortunately, the way things are made today, it's not done the way it was in the 60s and 70s, where these creative people just get a budget and they make this special. It's got to go through focus groups. It's got to be watered down. It has to be politically correct. That's why they don't show the little drummer boy anymore. And you mentioned before, Christmas is about the birth of Jesus. It's not about marketing, stuff to sell stuff at stores and everything like it's become, and the little drummer boy, that story is all about what Christmas is about. Why isn't that being shown anymore? It's sad.
Well, things have really changed. I cannot believe that they're not showing it on purpose, because that's one of my favorite Rankin Bass productions around the Christmas time. I have it on DVD. I watch it every year. But wow, things are just things are different now, and I don't think they're different in a good way. And I think that's why so many people gravitate to things like the original Rankin Bass production, the holiday TV specials, because it brings us back to a simpler time, maybe a more sane time, and it's just magic on top of that.
Yeah, and I get bombarded by emails and interviews and all kinds of things, because you're right. They want to go back to their childhood. They recognize that this was a good quality, time of, growing up and watching it that one time a year. And it means so much to so many. And, unfortunately, the entertainment business today, they don't understand any of it. Even the companies that own the Rankin Bass specials don't understand it. And they seem to not even understand that I'm the go-to guy, that I know what the fans want. And I've been dealing with this for over 30 years now, and I know exactly what it means to people and all the history behind it and everything. But these big companies, all they really care about is the money that it generates, which is sad. Look at The Wizard of Oz. That just got a 4K restoral. It's got 100, bonus features on the Blu-ray sets and box sets and everything. Rudolph is just as important as that film. And it's gotten nothing but shoddy DVD and Blu-ray releases, all garbage, except for the 2001 DVD where Arthur Rankin did an introduction and it had some bonus features. But pretty much since then, it's been all nothing but complete garbage. And I mean, I could talk about those things forever. What's wrong with them? But I should be talking about what's right with them.
One thing that I picked up when you were answering that question is you had mentioned that, people look forward to watching these Rankin Bass Christmas specials one time a year. And I tell you what, as a child, because that's the only way I had to watch it was, when it came out, when it was played on with the network right around Christmas time, right before Christmas time. There was something to having to wait for something you look forward to so much. That is gone now. There's no waiting for anything.
Yeah, it's kind of sad.
And I don't know if that's a good thing, because I think that was part of the magic, was these things were so artistically brilliant, so creatively brilliant, so magical in their story and the feelings that it gave you, and you had but one time a year to see it, and it was just magic.
Right, exactly. And that was part of the charm. And now we have all this streaming, and, that new Disney Channel came out. Everyone's watching stuff on their phone, and there's just too much stuff out there. And look what a small percentage of it is the Rankin Bass quality. Like maybe 2% of all that content out there is quality, good programming. It's weird. There's just so much.
I think you highballed it with 2%. I think.
Yeah, it's pathetic. My kids now are in their mid-20s, and we went to the show, to the theaters, to see movies, and I always tried to just stick with the Pixar movies, all the way till Disney took it over, and Disney wrecked it. Every movie after Disney took over is not the same quality that it was when it was in the hands of the creators. And other than that, I don't really know what's going on anymore. Like, there's no studio in business now that I would say is doing the quality stuff that, the original Walt Disney did, or the Rankin Bass productions. There's nothing like that. Frozen 2 isn't cutting it.
Well, don't get me started on the Disney company. I don't. The Disney company of today drives me absolutely nutty. I just think they put out garbage. But I think the most important thing, and I think this sums up the experience of what Rankin Bass provided, is that, and even like an early Disney, like you mentioned, early Disney, and to me as a child, because the time period I grew up in, Hanna-Barbera did this to me as well, but it's how it makes you feel. It's about nothing else. How does it touch you, and how does it make you feel? And the Rankin Bass productions, even to an extent Hanna-Barbera, some of the early Disney stuff, it makes you feel. Jim Henson, some of the Jim Henson stuff, it makes you feel something. And today, I don't see that in productions. It doesn't make you, especially like for kids or family, it doesn't make you feel like these older quality companies, what they put out.
Right, exactly. I got to meet Bill Hanna and Joe Barbera and talk to them about Rankin Bass, and just sit down with them in their offices and hang out with them. And I really admire everything that they did. And a lot of people bash them and say, well, they went to this cheap form of animation, and the characters hardly move and all that, but the characters are so great. and so well designed and so wholesome. And they did so many of them too. There's a lot of magic and charm to their shows as well. But you're right. Today, it's all about the technology, and it's missing the heart and the warmth. And, even the music is nothing like what it was when they did How the Grinch Stole Christmas or any of the Rankin Bass, look at a Charlie Brown Christmas, that magic Vince Guaraldi music is unbelievable. And then you get this Frozen thing with that Let It Go, which I've heard people singing that thing is horrible. How could anybody even listen to that, let alone think it's a good song?
Well, let me tell you, Rick. I've got, like I said, a 9-year-old daughter. Those Frozen songs have burnt holes in my brain and my eardrums.
Oh, man. When I first saw that movie coming out and I saw the character design for that snowman, I have to say, when I looked at that and I compared it to Frosty, I'm thinking something's not right. That character design is so bad that I would have no interest in watching it at all, and then for it to become the huge success that it was, and that's only going to produce more things like it. To me, it's very, very sad. What today's generation is growing up with versus what I grew up with. We had so many cartoon shows in the 60s and 70s that were so good. I couldn't even count them all. There was Linus the Lionhearted and Tennessee Tuxedo and His Tales and Speed Racer, and the list goes on and on and on. And they're remaking all this stuff today because they can't come up with any better ideas. But we had a great run of animation growing up, and today, what do they have? Nothing. I don't think. That's me.
You can't even compare it. With my family, I love spending time with my family. I love watching, television with my family, in the evenings, and I always want to watch things from that time period. Even the 50s, the 60s, 70s, 80s. Everything was put together so much better. It was there's everything about the experience was better. How it made you feel is better than the stuff that's on today.
It was creative. If you look back at a lot of the shows I collect stuff on are like The Munsters, Bewitched, Batman, The Green Hornet, all that stuff. It was very creative. The Monkeys, it's look at all these different types of shows, monsters and cartoon characters and characters out of comic strips like Hazel and Dennis the Menace. And today, there's no creativity. That's why they keep remaking the shows we grew up with, They remake Speed Racer, they remake Scooby-Doo, remake whatever. That's all they do is remake, and there's no creativity anymore.
Yeah, and they're never as good. And Rick, I'll tell you right now, you're a man after my own heart. In my studio, I've got a shelf where I've got a collection going, and I'm looking up at it. I got the original Scooby-Doos, I got Rocky and Bullwinkle, I got Tales from the Dark Side, I got Twilight Zone, I got Alfred Hitchcock, I got Looney Tunes, Woody Woodpecker. I got my collection going.
You're right. All creative things, and I'm a creative person. So it bothers me more than it bothers, people that don't see the difference between creative stuff and just remaking garbage to make money, and that's what gets me mad. But, oh well, I'm just glad I came from the time period that I did. and got to enjoy all the good stuff, you know? And I feel sad for people, young people that are growing up with what's going on today and not being able to enjoy the classics.
The only bright spot is technology is a double-edged sword. Bothers me a lot, all the tech stuff going on today. But the one bright spot is there's at least an opportunity between some of the digital releases and some of the DVDs even that are being released still or are available, that some of the stuff can be relived, just like the Rankin Bass Productions. I've got the collection in my home. I can relive it anytime I want.
Well, this year, one good thing about Rankin Bass is, for the first time ever, Freeform is showing Rudolph, Frosty, and Santa Claus is Coming to Town. Besides CBS and ABC, those three will be on Freeform. So it'll reach more of the younger audience than it has in the past. And then AMC started last year doing a marathon of all the Rankin Bass shows, and that was a big hit. That got a lot more people interested in Rankin Bass and the work I do, and they're doing it again this year. And I was supposed to host that to give some behind the scenes and so on and so forth. But for some reason, probably a committee of who knows how many people, they didn't go that route, which was a bad mistake in my opinion, because people do want to learn more about the Rankin Bass specials and see some of the artifacts and some of the rare things behind them. So hopefully in the future I'll be able to do that.
Yeah, I would love to see something like that. And honestly, you're so fascinating. I could talk to you for hours, and I hope to have you back on the show in the future, because I'd love to learn so much more about what you do and what you know. And you've just, you've enlightened me so much about Rankin Bass and so many other things as well. Tell me about some of the websites that are available and some of the books that you've written, where they can get those.
Sure. Our sixth book will be out by Christmas, and that's on Frosty. And all the books can be bought at miserbros.com. That's miserbros.com, like the heat miser and snow miser. And I keep a daily blog at enchantedworldofrankinbass.blogspot.com. And I do a lot of posting there about my appearances and all my collection. And I was on Collector's Call on MeTV with Lisa Welchel in the premiere episode, and it actually aired a couple of times. And I'll probably be doing some other television shows like that, where it goes over the history and the collection that I put together.
Well, I can't wait to see those, and I hope to see you more in the future and hear more from you in the future. Rick Goldschmidt, a Rankin Bass historian, biographer, and all-around fascinating guy. Thank you so much for being on the Chad Silveus Show, and I really hope to have you back soon.
Thanks for having me, and Merry Christmas.